So I've mentioned several times that this time period that's known as the Cold War is a push and pull between the United States and the Soviet Union for who will have the most influence in various locations around the globe. And this is really after the end of the Second World War, when we have this competing political ideology and economic ideology. And as this push and pull is going on, it is taking influence and impacting many parts of the world. The Cold War actually wages on through several presidents, certainly back to Johnson, Eisenhower, later on Nixon, Gerald Ford, President Carter, President Reagan. And this Cold War is really a backdrop against which most American foreign and domestic policy is posited through the time period that the Cold War follows. So President Jimmy Carter had a very specific diplomatic perspective that offered a departure from Nixon's pragmatism. Carter believed in placing emphasis on human rights, and he refused to support dictatorships just because they were anti-communist. Remember, this was a policy that became accepted, that as long as a country was anti-communist, it didn't really matter to many in the United States if their leaders were democratic or even nice. And so as a result of this shift in policy, Carter stops aid to Argentina, Uruguay, and Ethiopia. And because he does this because these are not democratic nations. They're certainly anti-communist, but they are not treating their people in the respective countries fairly or well. Less than ideal regimes in the Philippines, South Africa, and South Korea went unchecked, however, for national security reasons. So even though in some areas Carter's policy is very progressive towards human rights, in nations that have a different relationship with the United States, again, the Philippines, South Africa, and South Korea, Carter sort of turns a blind eye. Carter's efforts at moral leadership included an agreement to return the Panama Canal Zone to Panama, which removed the remnant of colonialism in that area. But this riled conservatives in the United States. Carter built on Nixon's pursuit of détente with the Soviet Union, extending full diplomatic recognition for the People's Republic of China in 1978, and signing the SALT II, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, with the Soviet Union leader Leonid Brezhnev the following year in 1979. Now, détente is a word that really refers to the easing of hostility or strained relations between two countries. And in this case, it refers to this period where the tensions are cold, but they are by no means gone between the Soviet Union and the United States. They are not as hot or as intense as they were during the Vietnam War. Carter's efforts at détente hit an obstacle when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. In response, Carter and Congress abandoned the SALT II agreement and increased military spending and boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Carter authorized the CIA to arm and assist Afghan rebels, including the Mujahid, the Holy Warriors, whose ranks included the Taliban and Saudi Arabian Islamic fundamentalist Osama bin Laden. Because previous presidents' foreign policies had left unsavory behavior. In 1975, the Senate held hearings on the FBI and CIA's activities that revealed illegal domestic spying as well as efforts to foment rebellion in other countries. Yes, this Mujahid, these holy warriors who date back to the 70s and the early 80s, do include a famous member named Osama bin Laden. Some of Carter's diplomatic successes included the negotiations of the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. This was a peace agreement that included Egypt's diplomatic recognition of Israel and Israel's return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. The deal came with U.S. aid to Egypt, but it did not establish a solution for the problem of Palestine. Carter ran into problems in Iran, however. Those problems stemmed from the CIA-engineered overthrow of the Iranian president in 1953 and the elevation of the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Pahlavi, whose regime had repressed and tortured Islamic fundamentalists. Pahlavi's lavish lifestyle also did not reflect the vast poverty within Iran. In 1979, Pahlavi was overthrown by the Islamic fundamentalist leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, who sought to bring the nation under the rule of strict Islamic law. Now, this distinction is very important. Under Pahlavi, we see a loosening of day-to-day life in Iran, and most men and women in Iran prior to Khomeini's rule look much like those in the United States in terms of dress and how they conduct themselves. Now, the deposed Shah, Pahlavi, was very ill with terminal cancer and as a result accepted an offer from President Carter to come to the United States for treatment. In response, Khomeini ordered Muslim students to seize the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and hold 52 hostages until the Shah was returned to Iran to stand trial. Carter's response was to freeze Iranian assets in U.S. banks, break off diplomatic relations with Iran, and implement an embargo, but those measures did nothing to ease the crisis, free the hostages, or keep oil prices low. In the midst of this crisis, oil prices increased by 130%. The hostage crisis intensified as Carter's unsuccessful attempt to rescue the hostages prompted the Khomeini guards to separate them. Khomeini further mocked Carter by releasing the hostages on the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration. Now, it is important here to note that Reagan campaigned on being aggressive with these people in other parts of the world that were conducting these atrocities. And he even supported military involvement if it was necessary to return these hostages. Ronald Reagan's approach to the Cold War was significantly harsher than that of his predecessors. He described the Soviet Union as, quote, the evil empire, end quote, and, quote, the focus of evil in the modern world, end quote. His attitude reflected the nation's defense spending, which accounted for about $257 billion of the U.S. budget by the end of his administration. President Reagan proposed the Strategic Deals Initiative, dubbed Star Wars, that would send anti-ballistic missiles into orbit. The government would spend $17 billion on research for this highly criticized science fiction-like weapons system, but made no progress. Hoping to project strength, Reagan proposed a zero-option strategy to push the Soviets to disarm certain missiles in exchange for the United States agreement not to deploy medium-range missiles. The Soviets surprised the Reagan administration by accepting this deal, and Reagan inaugurated the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, called START, in 1982. The United States offered to cease the deployment of particular missiles if the USSR would dismantle intermediate-range ballistic missiles in the Eastern European areas, but the Soviets rejected this proposal. In spite of efforts to reduce tensions in the face of Reagan's hardline approach, the Cold War intensified when a Soviet fighter jet shot down a South Korean airplane carrying 269 passengers. The plane had drifted into Soviet airspace by accident and was shot down because of a series of Soviet mistakes. But Reagan used the incident to suggest that the USSR had bad intentions. The Soviets were certainly seeking to flex their muscles, and they truly felt no remorse for shooting down this South Korean plane. The United States retaliated by sending missiles to Western Europe, and the Soviets withdrew from the arms control talks and boycotted the 1984 Olympics, which were held in Los Angeles, California. Reagan often fought communism at the expense of human rights. And, like Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon before him, Reagan used the fear of communism to protect the nation's sphere of influence in Latin America. In the process, he violated the sovereignty of nations seeking to break the cycles of poverty. It's important to note here that many of Kennedy's policies were very much in line with Reagan's at a later time. In Nicaragua, a group of revolutionaries called the National Liberation Front, or the Sandinistas, ousted dictator General Somoza with their initial support from the Carter administration. As the Sandinistas developed a close relationship with Cuba, the Reagan administration came to believe that the Sandinistas were Soviet proxies. This is because the Soviets still held a lot of sway and influence in Cuba over the leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro. In 1982, Reagan directed the CIA to fund counter-revolutionaries known as Contras to overthrow the Sandinistas, but the Contras behaved in a brutal fashion, killing civilians and devastating the Nicaraguan infrastructure. In 1982, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, banning the U.S. government from assisting the Contras and disrupting Reagan's efforts to overthrow the Sandinistas. In spite of the Boland Amendment, Reagan found an alternative way to continue funding the Contra War. In an effort known as Project Democracy, Reagan ordered the CIA and the National Security Council to raise money to fund the Contra troops. In El Salvador, the Reagan administration supported a brutal regime that employed death squads to murder thousands of people who had protested the government. Reagan declared that the rebels in El Salvador were supported by the Sandinistas and Cuba, and that during this process, the United States spent over $5 billion to support the El Salvadorian military. Now, it is important to note that there was significant funding that was later determined to have been flowing into El Salvador from Venezuela, Russia, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Reagan's policies engendered opposition at home, and teach-ins, marches, and rallies consumed college campuses in the mid-1980s. However, in spite of domestic support for ordinary Salvadorians and other victims of violent regimes, most of those who fled their countries were denied asylum in the United States. In 1983, Reagan ordered the invasion of the Caribbean island of Grenada to prevent a coup from affecting the American medical students. The United States triumphed, and Reagan's popularity rose as he put a pro-American government in power. Reagan prioritized anti-communism over human rights, and his administration made an ideological distinction between a non-communist authoritarian regime, which they deemed to be acceptable, and communist totalitarian regimes, which were not. In South Africa, where apartheid, which was a severe form of racial segregation, ruled, South African Communist Party fought the white totalitarian government, which led Reagan to express support for the regime. The nation boasted significant wealth and natural resources, which generated interest in the United States. In 1986, Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which Reagan vetoed. Congress overrode the veto, reflecting the popularity in support for this legislation. In 1982, a suicide bomber attacked U.S. troops stationed in Lebanon, killing 283 soldiers. Though Reagan subsequently withdrew the remaining troops, tensions in the Middle East continued to mount. Terrorism was a significant threat to American interests in the Middle East, with 17 dead and 154 injuries in 1985 alone. Attacks included the hijacking of an airliner in Athens and an Italian cruise ship in the Mediterranean. Both incidents involved hostages, and one American was killed. Reagan responded to this by blaming the Libyan military dictator Muammar Gaddafi, who offered refuge for terrorists and who attacked American forces near Libya. In addition to placing an embargo on Libya, Reagan sent U.S. military planes to bomb Tripoli after a nightclub attack in West Berlin that had resulted in significant casualties. Gaddafi remained in power but laid low. In the Middle East, the Reagan administration offered support to Iraq in its ongoing war with neighboring Iran, but Reagan engaged with Iran as well. In 1985, Reagan's national security advisor secretly sold anti-tank missiles to Iran in exchange for that nation's efforts to free 7 Americans who had been kidnapped by Shiite Muslims. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, an aide to the National Security Council, devised a plan to divert funds from the sale of Iran to the Contras in Nicaragua as a way around the Boland Amendment. With Reagan's support, the Arms for Hostages Amendment transferred between $10 and $20 million from Iran to Nicaragua. The Iran-Contra scandal was uncovered in 1986, and the Senate held televised hearings that led to the indictments of NSC advisor Vice Admiral John Poindexter, Oliver North, and several others. Though the scandal was the most extreme case of government misconduct since Watergate, Reagan emerged relatively unscathed, in part because he had expressed confusion or forgetfulness about the affair. Anti-nuclear protests were widespread in the 1980s, placing pressure on the Reagan administration to ease international tensions and reduce armaments. Women were at the forefront of the anti-nuclear campaign, and peace camps in England in 1981 inspired the Women's Encampment for a Future of Peace and Justice at Seneca Falls, New York. This captured the public's attention. The year of 1980 saw the inception of a nuclear freeze movement, which called for the cessation of the production of nuclear weapons. And in 1982, more than 750,000 people participated in the largest peace demonstration in U.S. history in New York City's Central Park. The United Nations adopted a nuclear freeze resolution, and a measure to institute an immediate freeze nearly passed the House of Representatives. The nuclear freeze movement had momentum in religious circles and even influenced Barry Goldwater, who declared that the nation had developed a sufficient arsenal. By 1982, 57% of Americans favored a nuclear freeze, and in 1983, in a television drama the day after, offered a harrowing glimpse into the aftermath of a nuclear attack on the United States. Reagan responded by working to a degree of disarmament, but he credited European activists with inspiring the efforts. Here on this map, you can see the OPEC nations, which are the nations that were not a part of the United States sphere of influence. And so you can see that these are areas that are important for anyone who wants to have influence around the world, and importantly, anyone who wants to have access to oil. Reagan's second term was marked by significant de-escalation of the Cold War tensions that was brought about by the combination of Reagan's political conservatism, his anti-communist credentials, and the prioritization of pragmatism over dogma. The Soviet Union underwent a pronounced transformation in the middle of the 1980s, with a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, taking power and implementing a program of glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. Gorbachev began to allow democratic elections, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press as part of an effort to reduce tensions with the United States. Reagan and Gorbachev met in person on several occasions, including at a 1986 summit, where they agreed on weapons reductions. Gorbachev offered to eliminate all of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons in exchange for the United States ending their Star Wars program, but Reagan declined. In 1987, the United States and the Soviet Union signed an Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which called for the reduction of the stockpile of intermediate-range missiles and the implementation of on-site inspections by 1987. Reagan's attitude toward the Soviet Union had shifted, and the Cold War was coming to a close. When George H.W. Bush took office in 1988, he encountered a world that was in transformation, beginning with Poland, where dock worker Lech Wałęsa led a solitary movement. The nations in the Soviet Union sphere pushed for democratic freedoms, and Gorbachev obliged, offering sovereignty to all Warsaw Pact nations in 1989. In the following year, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all broke away from Soviet and communist control. In Romania, we see the overthrow and assassination of their leader. Recall from the end of World War II, those nations that I just mentioned, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, are all parts of this sphere that the Soviets wanted to control to have a buffer between themselves and Germany. And so Gorbachev's willingness to allow these nations to break away is very significant and should not be understated. As the geographic structure of the Soviet Union broke down, so too did the nation's most stark symbols, including the Berlin Wall, which fell in a jubilant display on November 9th, 1989. As the Soviet Empire came apart, the Soviet-Afghan War came to a close. The ensuing civil war in Afghanistan left the country devastated and propelled to power the Taliban, a group of Sunni fundamentalists that harbored the Mujahid rebels like Osama bin Laden. In 1990, free elections in the Soviet Union brought challenges to the Gorbachev administration, with Boris Yeltsin leading the push for capitalism. In 1991, a coup led to Gorbachev being put under house arrest. After he was released, he resigned, and Boris Yeltsin brought about the free market reforms and expanded Russian democracy. As the Cold War ended, President Bush and Gorbachev signed the START I, and in 1993, Bush and Yeltsin signed the START II agreement, in which the two nations agreed to dismantle their multiple warhead intercontinental missiles within 10 years. Now, on this map, we can see the republics of the former Soviet Union, and initially recall from earlier in the semester, this area here is part of the Soviet Union as well, or at least part of their influence. And the Soviets wanted to continue to have influence in this area after the Second World War. And they do continue to hold this territory until the end of the 1980s, when Gorbachev allows these nations here, and then later these nations here, to be able to hold democratic elections. The aftermath of the Cold War saw the emergence of an age of competition and globalization, or the building of political, economic, and cultural networks. Russia's new participation in the G8, which was formerly called the G7, with the United States, the United Kingdom, France, West Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada, consolidated global power and production. As globalization gained momentum, so too did the development of multinational corporations, or corporations that have production and service facilities in more than one country. Over the last 3 decades of the 20th century, the number of multinational corporations increased from 7,000 to more than 60,000, including American companies like McDonald's and Walmart, and foreign companies like Toyota and Honda. Globalization was manifested in popular culture as well, with reality shows like American Idol migrating to the United States from Great Britain. In addition, cable networks emerged to cater to specific audiences, including the Cable News Network, or CNN, the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, and Al Jazeera, which is an Arabic language news channel. Organized labor suffered in the context of globalization, with union membership hitting a low of 12.5% in the context of an industrial workforce in 2004. Workers in unregulated factories around the world were paid very low wages, and products were unregulated, particularly in China. Production and globalization fueled pollution around the world. The landscape and atmosphere of developing nations changed as well, as forests were depleted and factories spewed byproducts into the air and water. The use of coal, petroleum, nuclear power, and electricity, along with large gas-guzzling vehicles, fueled environmental change in those industrialized nations. Environmental change facilitated a process of global warming that began to melt the polar ice caps and threatened the well-being of humans and animals. So, industrialized nations signed the Kyoto Protocol, which attempted to reduce greenhouse emissions, but the U.S. Senate failed to ratify this treaty. Globalization also brought attention to the mounting AIDS crisis, with 33.2 million afflicted with the disease by the turn of the century. As the crisis spread, medical treatment improved, and the United Nations and the World Health Organization offered relief to countries that were heavily impacted by this disease. The dissolution of the Soviet Union created a power vacuum in world affairs, and changes around the world began to assuage long-standing conflicts. The United States was limited in its ability to fill this vacuum. When 200,000 Chinese students and intellectuals protesting in Tiananmen Square were violently suppressed, the United States did nothing. President Bush issued a temporary ban on sales with China, but even this ended once public outrage over the Tiananmen Square massacre subsided. In Panama, the United States clung to a tenuous relationship with General Noriega, who had helped the CIA to support the Contras, but also formed an allegiance with Cuba. Manuel Noriega also aided the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency at the same time that he worked with Latin American drug lords, leading grand juries in Florida to indict him on drug smuggling and bribery charges. The United States attempted to spur a coup against Norwegia, increasing the U.S. tensions with Nicaragua and prompting Bush to launch Operation Just Cause on December 29, 1989. 27,000 Marines invaded Panama and captured Norwegia, who stood trial in Florida. He was sent to prison in 1980. He was sent to prison in 1992. In 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait with 100,000 troops so that Iraq could use Kuwait's oil resources to rebuild their economy. Bush responded by organizing an international coalition to stop Iraq from gaining control of a quarter of the world's oil supply and pushing further into Saudi Arabia, which was a key U.S. ally. Bush gave Hussein a deadline of January 15, 1991, to withdraw his troops from Kuwait. In spite of public opposition, Bush asked Congress to approve the use of the military against Iraq. Hussein ignored the deadline, and Bush inaugurated Operation Desert Storm on January 16, 1991, launching airstrikes on Baghdad and other Iraqi cities. After Hussein continued to refuse to capitulate, 500,000 ground troops moved on Kuwait on February 24, 1991. Those American service members drove the Iraqi forces out of the country within 100 hours. Once the Iraqi troops were out of Kuwait, Bush resisted the pressure to topple Hussein's regime, valuing the preservation of U.S. oil interests in the Middle East. Though the United States accomplished its goal of liberating Kuwait, Hussein brutalized the Iraqi rebels and slaughtered the Kurds and the Shiites, prompting the Bush administration to enact a new policy of containment. After the success of the American intervention in the Iraq War, President Bush sought help to end the continued conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The resulting peace talks ended with a 1993 agreement for an eventual Palestinian self-government in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank.